Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm Bruce Henry, the head of School of Mathematics and Statistics at UNSW Australia. I'd like to begin just the way we normally do on occasions like this by paying my respects to the original owners of this land, the Bedegal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to the elders past and present. It is really a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce to you this public lecture by Professor Jeffrey Rosenthal on Lotteries, polls and Monte Carlo. Jeff's visit is sponsored by the Australian Mathematical Sciences Institute and the Statistical Society of Australia. And it's fair to say that these big bodies and their affiliates really believe that promoting the importance of mathematics and statistics is one of the keys to a prosperous and successful Australia. We're currently living through what has variously been described as the information age or the digital age. So in this age, the health of the world economy is increasingly dependent on extracting knowledge from data. And mathematics and statistics is all about that. Some of you might know that the national curriculum of mathematics education in Australia at secondary school levels is being overhauled. A new curriculum is being developed which will include quite a significant part of statistics in that. The universities in Australia and globally are really growing in areas of statistics and data science. Our speaker today is an internationally renowned statistician. He's an author of a graduate textbook, an undergraduate textbook, a popular book that you might have noticed on your way in, Struck by Lightning, The Curious World of Probabilities. Jeff said that he'd be happy to sign copies of that book for anybody after his talk here today. That book's been published in 10 languages. A little bit about Jeff's background. He received his PhD specialising in mathematics, physics, computer science from the University of Toronto, Canada, 1988. He obtained his PhD from Harvard University in 1992. He's currently a professor in statistics and in mathematics at the University of Toronto. He's received numerous honours and awards for his teaching, service and research. These awards include teaching awards from both the University of Toronto and the University of Harvard, award from the Centre de Recherche Mathématique and the Statistical Society of Canada Prize, the Committee of Presidents of Statistical Societies Award, the Statistical Society of Canada Gold Award, and he's been elected as a Fellow of the Institute of Mathematical Statistics, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. So Professor Rosenthal is truly one of the world's foremost educators in bringing statistical analysis to the public domain. I very much want to welcome him here. Please join me, Professor Jeffrey.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out and to the organizers. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I've been on kind of a whirlwind tour of your beautiful country. This will be I've been giving both talks for general audience like this and also research talks, and this will be the 5th talk I've given in the last 3 days. So excited to see you all and very excited to be here. And so I work on sort of probability, randomness, uncertainty, and so on. And to start off with a little bit about myself with this work, so I'm a professor of mathematical statistics. So that means that a lot of the work I do is pretty technical, and this is sort of an excerpt from a recent technical paper I did, and you can see things get a little technical, but that's not what I'm going to talk to you about today, because I'm also interested in how randomness and probabilities sort of come up for everyday life and everyday situations. And as was mentioned, I was just busy doing this technical work, and then I wrote this book, which I see they very kindly have on display in the hallway, and this had a really big effect on me because, to everyone's surprise, especially mine, the book actually did really well, especially in Canada, and it made some bestseller lists and so on. And so as a result, it meant that I was kind of in the media, and by the way, it was also published in Australia by ABC Books, and published in other countries too. And then I was in the media, so somehow I was interviewed about all sorts of different subjects that came up related to randomness and probability. So, for example, public opinion polls, whether it's for an election or whatever. I got interviewed quite a bit about those. Crime statistics, are things really getting more dangerous? Are they getting safer? What's your chance of being a victim of crime and so on? Pedestrian death counts. One time in my city of Toronto, there were more people than usual killed by cars while walking. And does that mean there was the start of a new trend, or it didn't? So I was interviewed about that. Things about making decisions in the face of randomness, whether you should plan an outdoor event if it might rain, or wait for the bus if it might be late, anything like that, and how you can try to make sense out of that. Game show strategies. So there are game shows. They say the contestants have to make choices. So they interviewed me how I would make the choices based on probability. Fortunately, my choices turned out to be better than what the contestants did, so that was good. Sports statistics comes up all over the place. I've been asked to predict the probability of a team winning or analyze a sports tournament and so on. So I've done a lot of that. Different kinds of contests and promotions, and what's the chance you're going to win the contest. And lotteries, a lot. What's the chance I'm going to win the lottery? How big's the jackpot? Am I going to win? How many prizes are there? So lots and lots of interviews and stories about lotteries. It's probably the thing that I've been interviewed about more than anything else, actually. Everyone wants to know about lotteries. And so in preparing for this lecture tour, well, turns out there's lotteries in Australia too. And in particular, one of them is the Oz Lotto, and I love the name. And I thought that's pretty cool, and they have advertising, if you win, you might be able to buy your own boat, apparently. And so they have these nice promos. And so how does a lottery like that work? Well, they say, to win, you have to choose the right 7 numbers in this case. So they choose 7 numbers between 1 and 45, if I understand the webpage correctly, and you get to choose 7 numbers between 1 and 45. And to win the jackpot, all you have to do is choose the same 7 numbers as the company chooses. So, easy, right? Because somehow 7 is not a very big number, and 45 isn't a very big number. It doesn't seem like it would be that hard to choose the right number. So, well, it should be one chance, your chance of winning the lottery should be one chance in what? All the different ways that you could choose 7 numbers from 1 to 45, and we might call that 45 choose 7. And as you may know, it works out to be a pretty big number. It turns out there's lots of ways you can choose 7 numbers from 1 to 45. There's about 45 million of them. So when you buy an Oz Lotto ticket, you might win the jackpot, but you have about 1 chance in 45 million of being able to buy your boat here, right? So I tell people this a lot because people ask me a lot about lotteries, and I say, it's really not very likely that you're going to win the lottery, but they say, yeah, but I think I'm going to win. I think, I feel like I've got a good chance, and, I don't care about your numbers. So I always try to put it in perspective. And, what does it mean if something's really unlikely, like the chance that you're going to win the lottery jackpot? Well, so remember, the Oz Lotto is about 1 chance in 45 million. What can we compare that to? So let's say, by comparison, what can we compare that to? Well, compared to the chance of winning the jackpot, it's about 15 times as likely that you'll be killed by a bolt of lightning in the next year. Probably you won't be, right? So you probably won't win the lottery. It's about 17 times as likely that the person next to you will one day be the Prime Minister of Australia. I worked that out. So again, not very likely. It's about 6.5 times as likely, if you have to drive to the store to buy your ticket, that you will be killed in a car accident while you're driving to the store to get your ticket, compared to winning the lottery jackpot. Or to give a more fair comparison, it's about equally likely that a randomly chosen adult woman will give birth in the next 21 seconds. It's not very likely, right? Or one other way to think about it is, suppose you buy your Oz Lotto ticket once a week, every week, regularly, then you will win the jackpot on a regular basis, approximately once every 870,000 years. So, it puts it in perspective, and so I talk about these things to try to give a perspective on just how unlikely it is, something like winning the jackpot when you buy the lottery ticket. But I put it that way, people say, Jeff, you're kind of a killjoy, right? Because, people like to dream, like, I think I'm going to win the lottery, and imagine all the things you're going to do, all the boats you're going to buy, whatever. And, and then here I say it's not very likely, but I don't just say it because of the lottery, because the point is there's a lot of bad things that we worry about that are also really unlikely. So for example, that's unlikely, but airplane crashes, for example. I flew here yesterday morning on Qantas Air, and I was okay, right? And usually airplanes don't crash, and in fact there's only about 1 commercial flight in 5 million that has an accident which involves fatalities. So just like I want to stress that you're really not going to win that lottery jackpot, you're also probably not going to be killed the next time you fly in an airplane. And yet people worry a lot about that. And the same with, your child being abducted, or a terrible home invasion, or being killed by terrorists, or, a big explosion. All the things that a lot of people worry about, a lot of them are really very unlikely. We think they're more likely because we see them in the news every now and then, but they're actually very unlikely. By contrast, some things aren't that unlikely, and things like heart attacks and cardiovascular disease, ultimately will get a lot of us, and in fact, over a third of people will die from heart attacks or cardiovascular disease eventually. And one thing I find interesting to think about is that one of the stress factors for cardiovascular disease, one of the risk factors is stress, right? That is to say, the more stressed you are, the more likely you are to have a heart attack. And so it seems to me it's pretty likely, I can't really prove it, but it seems probable that more people die from heart attacks from worrying about things like child abductions and airplane crashes than actually die from child abductions and airplane crashes. So if there's any lesson here, it's that, you shouldn't plan on winning that lottery jackpot, I'm sorry, but you shouldn't worry about airplane crashes and child abductions and buildings collapsing and all the things that we might worry about, but that are really very unlikely things. So if there's any one point of the talk, maybe it's that. Some things really are unlikely, and really stop and think about what that means. And I used to be kind of a nervous flyer when I was in planes, and now I just don't worry because it's so unlikely that there's actually going to be a problem. So something to think about there. Something that's a bit related is what I like to call the out of how many principle. And let me set it up with a story. So here's a true story. Back when I was in my teens, my family went on a trip to Disney World in Florida. And while we were there, over a couple of days, we ran into my father's cousin, Phil. Wow, because, we lived in Toronto, Canada, and, he lived in Connecticut, actually, and we didn't know he was going to Disney World, and he didn't know we were going to Disney World, and we looked up, and there he is, right? And you think, well, how can you make sense out of something like that? Now, at the time, the population of the United States was about 230 million people. So you think, wow, it sounds like it was one chance in 230 million. Right? And it sounds incredible. And you say, this must have a great significance. There must be some message here. I'm supposed to, follow in my dad's cousin Phil's footsteps and do whatever he says. And there must be some importance to it. So how can you make sense out of this? Well, I discussed this one in my book, actually. And you can say, well, is it really one chance in 230 million? So then you start to think, well, we were at Disney World for a couple of days, right? And we waited on lots of lines and went on lots of rides and saw lots of crowds. So we probably saw several thousand people close enough that if they had been my dad's cousin Phil, we would have recognized them. So I wrote that there's about several thousand people we saw. So right away you can say, well, it wasn't just one chance in 230 million. It was several thousand chances in 230 million. But that's still pretty unlikely, right? But then you say, well, wait a minute, my dad's cousin Phil wasn't the only person that we would have been really surprised to see. Right? What about my dad's other cousins, or my mom's cousins, or my piano teacher, or my friend from elementary school? Or you start to realize all the people that you've met and that you've known that if you suddenly saw them at Disney World, it would be amazing, right? So there's at least several hundred people that probably could make a list, saying it would be amazing if I ran into this person when I went to Disney World. So somehow it's not just one chance in 230 million. It's not just several thousand chances in 230 million, but several thousand times a few hundred chances in 230 million. And when you put that all together, and I discuss this in the book, you get roughly one chance in 200 that if you go to Disney World for a couple of days and see all these crowds of people, you'll run into somebody that you didn't expect to see there. So then you say, well, okay, maybe it's not that unlikely after all. And then furthermore, over the course of a lifetime, you go to lots of places, right? You don't just have one trip. You go to different places. You join different clubs. There's all different places that you might go that you might run into somebody that you're completely surprised to see. So over the course of a lifetime, maybe this isn't so surprising. And it happens a lot. And in fact, maybe if you don't mind, I'll just ask by a show of hands, who would say you have some story like that where you ran into somebody in a place where you completely didn't expect to see them and it was a complete huge surprise? Who says, yeah, I've got some story like that. Okay, fair number, probably maybe half, almost half. And I find this a lot, and somehow it seems like it's such an unlikely thing, but when you put it together, it's not that unlikely, and that's why most people have a story like that. It doesn't mean it's not a nice story and it's not really cool, but it puts it in perspective in terms of whether it has a deep significance or whether it's something we'd expect to happen every now and then, because of this sort of out of how many principle, as I say. So let me switch gears a little bit and talk about coin tossing. So we probabilists, we love coin tossing and heads or tails and so on. And sort of illustrate some of the things I want to talk about, including related to opinion polls. But let me start off with coin tossing. So, we all know you flip a coin, heads or tails, and, the probability is about a half or 50% that you get heads each time. But if you flip a bunch of coins, well, will you get exactly half heads? Probably not exactly half heads, right? So you might get close, but how close do you expect to get to getting 50% heads? And it turns out this is an important question for the polls. So to try it out, I thought I'd run the first of a few little computer simulations. So let's see if this is working okay. So what I did here, this is a very simple computer program I wrote, which flips coins, because I don't have enough time to flip all the coins I want to flip for real. So it'll do sort of fake randomness and fake some coins. So I started by flipping 10 coins. And the idea is it just kicked out. I hope you can read that okay. I could make it even bigger, but that's it. Head, heads, tails, heads, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, heads. So that's the random result of flipping 10 coins. So in this case, we got the number of heads was a 7 out of 10, or 70% heads. So it wasn't 50% heads, it was 70% heads. Let me see if I should try to make that a little bigger. A little bigger. So let's flip it again. So again, I flipped 10 coins. Oh, this time, and again, it's random, but this time it looks like we got a total of 3 heads out of 10, so 30%. So not that close to 50%. That time we got 40%. That time we got exactly 50%. Oh, 70%, 40%, and so on. So it's okay, fine. I'm flipping coins. I get maybe about half heads, but it's not that close to being a half head. But what if I flip more coins? That's when it gets more interesting. So let me modify this. So instead of flipping 10 coins, I flip 100 coins. And so it kicks out a big string of heads, tails, tails, heads, whatever. And it counts them up for me, and it said there was 52% heads. Well, that's pretty close to 50% heads, right? It won't always be that close. Let's try it again, flipping 100 coins. We got 47% heads, 44% heads, 36% heads. That one was pretty far from 50%. 47%, 50%, 48%, 49%, 43%. So we keep getting these number of flips, and well, they're still not that close to 50%, but they're closer, right? And somehow it seems like we're flipping more coins, we're getting closer to 50%. Let's do another one. Let's go, say, 1,000 coins. Well, here we go. Everyone stand back and get a big list of heads, tails, heads, whatever. It goes right off the screen, but fortunately it counted for us. It worked out to 50.7% heads. That's pretty close to 50%. Let's try that a few more times. 51.5%, 51.4%, 48.2%, 49.5%, 51.4%. So you can see they're getting closer and closer, right? So, and this is quite an important principle. So I wanted to discuss that. So, it seems like we get pretty close. And in fact, probabilists have worked on it. I mean, it's possible that you get no heads, right? Or it's possible you get 100% heads. But it seems like it's more and more likely that you get closer and closer to 50% heads. And in fact, if you flip, say, some number n of coins, this just stands for 10 or 100 or 1,000 or whatever, then usually, so we say 95% of the time, or 19 times out of 20, you'll get kind of close to 50% heads. How close? Well, it gets closer the bigger n gets. So in particular, you'll get, and it works out to roughly take 98% and then divide by the square root of the number. Now, hope nobody's too afraid of square roots here. You don't have to compute them, but the point is the simple formula says take 98% divided by the square root of n. That says about how close you will be most of the time to 50% heads, or we sometimes call that a margin of error. So if you look at it in a table, well, with 100 coins, it works out to about a 10% margin of error. So in other words, it's saying that usually, about 95% of the time, you'll get between 40% and 60% heads. But if you flip 400 coins, this margin of error goes down to about 5%, so you'll be usually within 45% to 55% heads. If you flip 1,000 like we just did, the margin of error goes down to about 3%, so you'll be roughly between 47% to 53% heads. But most of the time, right? It's not a guarantee, but most of the time. With 5,000 goes down to about 1.4%, or with 10,000 goes down to about 1%. So if you flip 10,000 coins, you'll usually be within about 1% of having 50% heads. Now, you might say, well, first of all, the more coins you have, the larger the n is, the smaller this margin of error is, and the closer you are to the true probability of 50% heads. And, once you understand that, you might say, so what? So, I mean, it's called the law of large numbers sometimes, but in this context, you say, okay, fine, if I flip 10,000 coins, I get close to 50% heads, but who cares about that? Well, it turns out to be important in a number of ways, and one is that it's exactly the same formula and exactly the same way working with public opinion polls. So I thought I'd illustrate this by, I think if there was something in the news, so if there was some recent election that you might have heard about here, and I thought, I wonder what election you might have heard about down here, and thought you might have heard something about this one, right? So, the U.S. presidential election, of course, just happened, and for purposes of this lecture, we're just thinking about the polls, so it's nothing to do with whether, the Americans should have elected the former senator and secretary of state, or the nutcase, they should, that has nothing to do with what I want to talk about here, but the point is, what about these public opinion polls, right? Because as you probably know, there were lots and lots of public opinion polls, and what did they say, and how did that work in with the margin of error? Well, here's one example. This was a poll that was published on, they say, the eve of the election, and they said, Hillary Clinton was at 47% in their poll, and Donald Trump was at 43%. And if you look down further in the article, at some point you get the fine print, which nobody reads, but they should, because it says, well, when it was sampled and how many people were sampled, and they have these margins of error, right? You've probably all seen them. And in this case, they say, well, they sampled 3,218 people and got a margin, an error margin, they called it, of plus or minus 2.5%. And then they said, it was plus or minus 2% for this thing, but then among the likely voters, which were just 2,220 of them, got plus or minus 2.5%. And most people sort of see those things, but well, what do they mean? And in particular, how do they compute them? Well, now we know a formula. So we can say, well, the margin of error should be 98 divided by the square root of the number of people sampled. So for the overall one, this works out to about 1.7 something, which they kind of rounded up to 2%. And that's how they got their 2% margin of error. Or for the likely voters in this case, 98 over the square root of 2,220, well, it works out to 2.07 something. I guess they were feeling a bit generous and they rounded that up to 2.5%. But that's all they're doing to get these formulae. So it's nothing magic. It's just saying if you repeated the experiment over and over again, whether it's flipping coins or phoning people at random and asking them who they're going to vote for, how close do you get to the true probabilities? Now, if you think of it that way, it kind of takes into account what we sometimes call the sampling error or the statistical error, but maybe not other kinds of errors. So you could say, well, were they really within this kind of margin of error? But anyway, it's a simple formula for computing margin of error, so you can amaze your friends by being able to compute the margins of error for them when you see polls. Still on this election, well, there were a lot of other polls that were published in the days before the election. What about them too? So here's a table, and I don't know how well you can read it, but you don't have to, but it talks about a lot of different companies and their polls that were done just in the days before the election, and in particular they have the margin. You can see almost all of them predicted Clinton to win by whether it's plus 3.3 or 3 or 4, 4, 4, 6, 4, 4. One of them predicted Trump would win. But mostly they said Clinton would win by approximately 4%. And they all published various margins of error, which you can see here. And the margins of error are usually a couple of percent, 2 or 3%. And, but then on the other hand, there were all these different polls. And if you imagine combining them together, it's kind of like you're sampling more people. And the margins of error get much smaller. So if you imagine combining all these polls, almost all of them said Clinton's going to win by about 4%. And these margins of error were all pretty small, and when you combine them together, it should be a really small margin of error. So they should have been really confident Clinton's going to win by about 4%. Well, so what happened? Well, and by the way, but based on this, forecasters were predicting who's going to win the election, and one publisher said they were 85% certain Clinton was going to win the election. Someone else said 92.2% certain, 95% certain. One, which was Nate Silver, if you know who he is, who tries to balance all these things out. He only said 71.4%, and some people criticize him. They say, he's being too conservative. It should be more certain that Clinton's going to win. And then what happened with the results? Well, if we go by the popular vote, Clinton got 47.83% of the votes cast, at least at the last tally, and Trump got 46.56%. So it means if you just look at the votes, as you may already know, Clinton actually won the popular vote by over 1%. And but on the other hand, as you may know, the system in the United States actually apportions votes according to a state-by-state vote, and in the Electoral College state-by-state vote, Trump got more of the Electoral College votes, and that's why he is the president-elect. So then you can say, well, wait, the polls, a lot of people say the polls got it all wrong, right? So, well, what can we say? Well, first of all, the polls were not off by as much as some people maybe think. So they said she'd win by about 4%. She actually won in the popular vote by about 1.27%. And now, of course, it's more complicated when you try to do the state-by-state electoral college vote, and there's certain states that people predicted wrong, but not by as much wrong as some people think. But there was still some genuine error, and a lot of that is due to whether it's non-respondents, that is people who won't answer the polling company, but then they're going to go out and vote, and whether that happens in an unbalanced way, or people who say they're going to vote, but then they don't get around to voting because they weren't that enthusiastic in the first place. And also late deciders, people say, gee, I don't know who I'm going to vote for, and then in the end they choose. And it seems like most of the late deciders, people who said they weren't sure till the last minute, they kind of went towards Trump, and some of the people who said they were going to vote for Clinton didn't bother to vote, more than Trump supporters and so on. So there was this sort of at the margins, things were off by a little bit. But I wouldn't say they were off by as much as some people think. But nonetheless, that made a really big difference because this few percentage switched around the Electoral College to the point where Trump won the election. So when you put that all together, well, what can we say? Can we still trust the public opinion polls? Well, kind of. So here's a cartoon that says this is Angela Merkel in Germany announcing she's going to run again. And, she can't lose, and she says it's a bad omen. So she's not very happy with the pollsters. So I think it's harder in a way to trust pollsters because the response rates keep getting lower and lower, and it's harder and harder for pollsters to put it together. But I still think under the circumstances they don't do as bad a job as some people think, and they're only off by a few percent. But if you have a very close election, then that can make all the difference. So anyway, that's just something to think about, and I'll leave that there. And I want to move on now to a different topic, and this is kind of a story, and it's a story that I call a statistical success, partially because I was involved in it, so that must mean it's a success. And it's related to lotteries again, and it's what came to be called the lottery retailer scandal. And what was this story? So it started with in Canada, so the CBC is like our ABC, and there's an investigative news program called The Fifth Estate, and they called me up and they said, are retailers who sell lottery tickets, are they maybe sometimes managing to steal winning tickets that belong to their customers? So what does that mean? Well, there was one case that was already known, and this was a case of an elderly gentleman who played the same numbers every week based on his grandson's birthdays and everything, and he went to the same convenience store every week, and he brought in his tickets and said, hey, did I win anything? He didn't check them himself. He just said, hey, did I win anything? And one week they said, oh, no, you didn't win anything. Okay, sorry. And then the next week, the owner of that convenience store cashed in a winning lottery ticket for $250,000. And it was in the local news, and he said, hey, wait a minute, those are the numbers I play every week. That was my ticket, and indeed, it turned out that the person selling the ticket had said, no, you didn't win, kept the ticket for herself, and cashed it in. And so he had to try to prove this, and the case went on for years, and eventually he got a settlement where he got some of the money back and so on, but there was a confidentiality clause. He wasn't supposed to tell anyone about it. Nonetheless, somehow the Fifth Estate program found out about it, and they said, gee, I wonder why the lottery company is working so hard to keep this quiet. Maybe there's more to the story. Maybe this happens in other cases too. So they put together some data, and it wasn't so easy even to get these numbers, but over a 7-year period, there were 5,713 major lottery prizes won in Ontario, in my province in Canada, and that's in all the different lotteries and all the different prizes and so on, of that much. And of those, approximately 200 of them were won by people who worked in stores selling tickets. In most cases by the owners of the stores, of small convenience stores. And so then you say, okay, well, if that's the data, then is that too many, right? Is there something suspicious? So this was a case where we weren't looking at any one retailer, but we were looking at the statistics and saying, is there some basis for suspicion here? And so I said, well, let's start out by computing the sort of expected number of these major lottery wins that the retailers should win if everything was happening fairly. And it was a little tricky because we didn't have clear figures on, first of all, how many of these retailers there were. They had good figures for how many different stores there were which sold lottery tickets, but not how many people worked at those stores. So that was a bit confusing. Also, as far as the people who did work there were no clear figures for how often they bought lottery tickets. Maybe they bought them more often too. So they kind of conducted a survey to figure that out. Also, even this figure of 200 was a little bit uncertain because the lottery company had tried to keep track of when a prize was won by someone who worked at a store, but they didn't keep very good records. So there was some uncertainty there too. But using the various possible figures involved, we said, how many should they win? Well, maybe they should win about 35 of these 5,700 major wins, or maybe 57, depending on which way you did the numbers. But in any case, it seemed clear that they should be winning much less than 200. But then you say, well, maybe they got lucky, right? Because after all, there's randomness and luck in a lottery. So what's the chance that if they bought a number of tickets that they should have won about this many, that they really ended up winning as many as 200? So I computed what we could call a sort of a p-value, if you know that expression, or in other words, what's the chance that just by luck alone, without any cheating, these retailers would have won 200 or more of them. And it turned out it was extremely small. It was like one chance in trillions of trillions, or maybe one chance in about 10 billion, depending on which way you did the numbers, but extremely small. So I said, okay, I think this proves it. This shows that these retailers were winning more than could be explained by chance. And I did my little interview with the TV investigative program. And I thought, okay, that's good. It's one more media interview, under my belt. And then the CBC was going to broadcast on a certain evening. And I guess that morning, they decided to give advance copies of the broadcast to some of the other news. And I woke up that morning to see that on the front page of the Globe and Mail, which is kind of the national newspaper in Canada, it had a big article about the insiders in one big box, and in the article, it actually talked about statistical analysis, has my name, and has the probabilities of trillions and all that. So this is the front page of the newspaper that morning before the program had even aired. So that, wow, it was a bigger story than I thought, right? And then it was in all the major newspapers in Toronto and in Canada. So it was the Toronto Star, the Toronto Sun. With a little picture. In fact, they had to lend me the lottery ticket for the picture because I never buy lottery tickets. So they said, hold this up and smile. So I did. And so all these reports about it. There were like editorials saying that the lottery company should have done a better job of protecting their customers. I especially like this editorial because in addition to discussing the whole story, it also mentioned the title of my book, which I always like to get out there too. So that was good. And then it became a sort of a political issue that the government of the day was accused of somehow not managing things well enough. I don't know if that was fair or not, but in any case, here's an official record from the the Hansard of the Ontario government, and there's people debating, and you can see here talking about me and my probabilities and so on, which I never thought would be debated in the provincial legislature, but there it was. And then they launched an official ombudsman's report. So there's an ombudsman's office that's supposed to keep track of government behaviors, and he said they were not protecting their customers. They were turning a blind eye while people were taking these tickets unfairly and so on, which again may or may not have been fair, but it was big news. The government had to respond somehow. There was a lot of pressure, so they responded by firing the CEO of the lottery company. So it's the first time that a CEO was fired because of my statistical calculations. And so he was fired in kind of a shock. And then they also, maybe on a more positive note, they introduced new rules. They said, look, from now on, even if you buy a lottery ticket and you're too lazy to check yourself to see if you won, instead of giving it to the customer, instead of giving it to the store owner and saying, hey, did I win anything? At least sign your ticket first so that it shows it's your ticket. So they introduced that rule. They also put in, I don't know if it says here, some self-checker machines so that even if you don't want to check by yourself if you won the numbers, you can stick a ticket in a machine yourself to see if you won before you give it to anybody, right? So all these new rules to try to reduce this problem. Then it became a police investigation. So I didn't really expect this, but the police stepped in and said, hey, if these retailers were winning, then that's fraudulent and we should investigate. And now it was a tricky year because my statistics had just said that I was pretty sure some of those winning tickets were fraudulent, but I couldn't say which one. But they started looking into more details, and in particular when the people had won the prizes, they were supposed to be able to explain where they bought the ticket and when they bought the ticket and how often they play those same numbers and so on. And some of these people couldn't explain it very well, so they got suspicious and they investigated and they planted some bugs and so on. Anyway, so they did a serious investigation and they started making arrests. And here's a case of someone who was actually eventually jailed for 1 year for criminal fraud for taking a $5.7 million winning lottery ticket that had belonged to 4 friends who one of them had taken it to check it and they said they didn't win and then cashed it himself. And in fact, those 4 friends ended up becoming bitter enemies because they thought that the other friend had taken their money, and it was very sad because actually no, it was the lottery retailer taking it. So he was jailed for 1 year, and the $5.7 million with interest was actually repaid to the people who should have won it. So first time my statistical calculations have led to millions of dollars in repayments, right? It's sort of incredible. Here's some of the winners trying to preserve their anonymity, I guess. And so that was pretty big. And then there were a few more cases. Here's one where someone was actually called out of the blue. She had no idea that she'd been cheated out of her winnings. They said, hey, we've done the investigation and this $80,000 should be yours. Thank you very much. The most dramatic story was actually one involving, first of all, $12.5 million, which, I don't know in Australia, but in Canada, that's a lot of money, right? And so about $12.5 million, and this investigation actually went on for several years, but there was suspicion on this. It was sort of a father and a son and daughter who owned a convenience store. They made this big prize, but it seemed like they didn't really know, they didn't know when they bought the ticket and where, and they put in a bug, and it seemed like they almost admitted that they just sort of found it or taken it or whatever. And anyway, after much investigating, they arrested the 3 of them, charged them with criminal fraud, and perhaps most interestingly, they said, gee, we don't know who should have won this $12.5 million. Interesting question, right? So they said, hey, who should have won it? And you can see here, the police were seeking the rightful winner. And so they pretty much just put out a call saying, attention please, does anybody have $12.5 million they want, right? And perhaps not surprisingly, there was a flurry of calls, right? A lot of people called, I think that could be my $12.5 million. And at this point, I wasn't involved with this part, but it was pretty interesting too, because they said, we're going to try to track it down. You know, the public reputation of the lottery company has been has suffered, and we're going to try to figure this out. And so they actually interviewed people who thought it might have been there and said, okay, well, how often do you buy tickets, and what numbers do you play, and where do you buy them, and what times a day? And they tried to piece it together. And I wasn't sure they'd be able to find the right people with any confidence, but they felt that they did, and they found that eventually this group of 7 working class people who played the numbers all the time and had certain patterns for which stores they go to and so on, they said, hey, this is yours. They paid them $12.5 million plus interest, worked out to $14.85 million by the time they were done, and these people were pretty happy about that. So, pretty amazing story, I think. Now, I want to move on to some other things, but just to finish this off, this was all within the province of Ontario, but actually it spread beyond Ontario too, and in particular within Canada, there were some others, including a similar investigation in British Columbia, and they fired their CEO too, so that kind of went on. And then a couple other places, including in Nova Scotia in Canada, where in this case, one of the government regulatory bodies actually hired me to help investigate, so that was good. I finally got paid something after all these other millions of dollars that everybody else had gotten. And then in the Western Canada, there was sort of a short thing that I did some media interviews and a little bit. But then in the United States, there was, first of all, one case in Arizona and one in Texas, although later they found some more, where those were specific cases where someone was found to have done this sort of fraudulent thing of taking the customer's tickets. And in California, they did actually a whole sting operation where they hired actors to take fake winning tickets into stores and say, hey, I don't think I won anything, but can you check? I'm just going to go get some milk. And then it came back, yeah, did I win anything? And out of, I think it was 35 different stores where they did this, in 6 of them, the seller said, no, you didn't win anything, and then tried to cash in the ticket as their own shortly afterwards, and got arrested for fraud. Right? So, an interesting sting operation. And then in Minnesota, there was a somewhat similar thing. And then there were some newspaper investigations that I kind of worked with them a little bit and got into the newspaper investigations in a number of other states and cities in the United States. And in each case, of course, there could be millions of dollars and possible fraud at stake. And now coming here, I thought, well, what about Australia? And as far as I know, there hasn't been any such investigation. And also, everyone I've met in Australia is very nice and honest, and I couldn't imagine anyone doing anything wrong. But nonetheless, the fact that it's happened in so many other jurisdictions gets you thinking, and I wonder, does anybody want to investigate and see about the lottery retailers here in Australia? So I don't know what the story is with that. But anyway, okay, so let me just say that, it all kind of followed from this simple statistics, and this is a nice article kind of summarizing my role in the thing. And if you are interested in learning more, I did write an article about the statistical aspects of this case, because I think it's huge impact and pretty interesting, and just based on some simple statistical calculations ended up showing this huge fraud and millions of dollars being repaid and all this stuff. So anyway, okay, so let me move on to something else, and actually this next one is a statistical failure, and just like the last one I could call a statistical success because I was involved in it, this one I can call a statistical failure because I was not involved in it, right? So this is actually from the justice world, and when I was getting well known in Canada, I was asked to speak to various groups, and in particular I was then asked to speak to some groups of prominent judges and lawyers, and they said, hey, what can you tell us about probability? So I thought, let me try to learn about ways that probability has interacted with the justice system. And the first case I want to talk about is this woman named Sally Clark. She was a solicitor in England, and this is actually quite a sad story because she had 2 sons, each of whom died in infancy. And they died of apparent suffocation with no clear cause. And so then you say, well, when babies die of apparent suffocation, it could be what's sometimes called cot death or SIDS or sudden infant death syndrome. What do you normally say here? Would you say a cot death here or SIDS? Okay, SIDS. So SIDS, a sudden infant death syndrome. And, was it that or murder, right? Maybe she suffocated her children. And a prosecutor in England decided this was suspicious, and she was actually arrested and charged with double infanticide. And at her trial, a pediatrician named Roy Meadow, he said the odds against 2 cot deaths in the same family are 73 million to 1. And the jury heard this, and the jury said, gosh, that seems incredibly unlikely. So therefore, maybe it wasn't 2 cot deaths, maybe it was murder. And indeed, Sally Clark was convicted of murdering her 2 children, pretty much just on the basis of this probability. There were some other aspects involved, but it was pretty much this. And she was jailed, and she was vilified in the press, And meanwhile, she'd had a third son who was temporarily taken away from her for his own protection. So a pretty serious sentence and consequences based on this probability calculation. So then you can say, well, gee, well, first of all, was that computation done correctly? And it seems like it wasn't done correctly, and I won't go into the details, but the calculation was flawed in a few ways, one of which was it sort of took into account certain risk factors which made it less likely, but it didn't take into account certain factors that made it more likely. So that was flawed. More fundamentally, it was flawed because they said, well, if there's 2 kids that died, I guess the probability must be take the probability of one kid dying and multiply by the probability of the other kid dying. So they kind of multiplied, which you can't really do because these are not independent events, because SIDS tends to run in families. So if you have one son that dies, it makes it somewhat more likely that the second son will also die of SIDS. So it was a flawed calculation, but I think more importantly, the interpretation was wrong, because somehow the feeling was, well, if it's 73 million to 1, that must be the chance that she's innocent, so therefore she must be guilty. But on the other hand, the probability of 2 SIDS deaths in this one specific family, which is what the 73 million to 1 would be, that's not the same as the probability of her being innocent of this crime. And as I say, one way to think about it is, again, this out of how many principle, right? Because you can say, well, it's not what's the chance that this one family had 2 SIDS deaths, but one way to think of it is, what's the chance that some family in the UK or some family in the world had 2 sons who both died of SIDS just by natural causes? And that's not that unlikely, just like the chance that at some point I'd run into my dad's cousin Phil or some other person is not so unlikely. So that's a way to think about it too. It's related to what sometimes called the prosecutor's fallacy, sort of conflating different probabilities, and in this case saying, well, because it's 73 million to 1, if it is, that these 2 sons would die in this one family, therefore that's the chance she's innocent, so it's too low, so she must be guilty. So it was a pretty flawed case, but she was convicted and jailed on that basis. After she was jailed, the Royal Statistical Society in the UK, they got involved, and they thought this was wrong, and they declared, they issued a statement saying that the approach was statistically flawed. And the UK General Medical Council got involved, and they said that Meadow, this pediatrician, that his evidence was misleading and incorrect, and in fact he was guilty of serious professional misconduct. So eventually, on her second appeal, while this was going on, Sally Clark was acquitted. So she spent more than 3 years in jail, and her own story is actually a very sad one, because she never recovered, and she actually was alcoholic, and she died of alcohol poisoning, and so her life was ruined by it. But meanwhile, because of this investigation, some other convictions were also overturned, where they also said, hey, you're being too quick with the probabilities. And this pediatrician Meadow was barred from doing any future court work. And, prosecutors and judges, well, we want to say they learned a valuable lesson. I actually have no idea if they learned a valuable lesson. Right? So, but nonetheless, it's a pretty interesting case, because it says that, if you're going to make decisions based on probabilities, you better be very careful to do it correctly, not only in terms of the actual probabilities, but in terms of the interpretation and in terms of what it really means, and think about this sort of out of how many, and think about the bigger context. So I think that's an important lesson. If you're interested in that, I wrote an article related to the issues of probability and justice in this case, which is also on my website. And but on the other hand, that's the case. So if you just hear about that case, you might think, yeah, we shouldn't really use these probabilities to convict people of things. But here's a case to make you think the opposite, maybe. So this is a case from some time earlier. It's this Hoyt family in New York State. And here they are with one of their babies. And they actually had 5 babies during this period. All 5 of them died of, again, apparent suffocation with no clear cause. And they were essentially all infants. Well, one of them was 2.5, but the others were all just a few months old. So they all died as infants of apparent suffocation. And somebody got interested and investigated. A pediatrician, he wrote a research article, and what did he say? Did he say, hey, these people must be guilty of murdering their children? No, he said, what interesting evidence for genetically linked SIDS, this idea that once one child dies of SIDS in the family, then it's more likely that other children will die too. So here's a case where there were 5 children who all died as infants, and the pediatrician said, oh yeah, this shows that this tends to run in families. That was his conclusion. And that's the way things stood for many years. And in fact, in 1977, they actually adopted a son who survived to adulthood. And when you adopt a son, there's an investigation, right? And they see, are you really fit parents? And they knew about this history, and they said, okay, it was just from SIDS. It's okay for them to adopt a child, which they did. In 1985, so 20 years or so after the first baby had died, somebody heard about this and got suspicious. And I think somebody who was like a friend or knew her, and then somebody who knew one of the investigating prosecutors and so on. And they sort of said, okay, let's put this together and investigate. And I guess they got the friend to talk to her, in confidence, but maybe with a wire, and found out things. And after a while, upon discussing this, he kind of broke down and said, yeah, I suffocated all 5 children to stop them from crying. Which is a pretty shocking story. And now, to be fair, she later recanted her confession, but that presumably was just to try to avoid the penalties when she was arrested. So presumably the confession was true, and she actually had suffocated her 5 children. So she was eventually convicted in 1995, so 30 years later, convicted of the 5 murders, and she actually died in prison. So what do we make of all this, right? It's sort of hard to put it together, because on the one hand, I want to say in the Sally Clark case, look, just look at the out of how many principle, and look at the fact that you can't just multiply these probabilities, and they were way off, and she should never have been convicted. But here's a case where there were not just 2 babies, but 5. And even though there's some genetic linkage, yes, there's not that much genetic linkage. So even though you can multiply, but how much genetic linkage is there? And in this case, I would have thought the evidence was at the very least strong enough to launch a serious investigation and at least consider charging them with murder, whereas in fact they were found to be fine at the time. So, how do you put that all together? I would say, well, you want to use probabilities. You don't want to say, we can't use probabilities when we're talking about criminals and when we're talking about convictions. You want to be able to use them. You just want to use them carefully, and you want to try to figure out when are the probabilities enough either to prove conviction or at least to show a strong suspicion, and when do they really not show that. And I think you have to learn to distinguish those cases. So, okay. Let me, how am I doing? I've got too much time left. Let me talk quickly about gambling. And I'll just spend a few minutes on this. So I'll consider, you probably know the game craps, and I don't know if you do, but it's a game where you roll 2 dice over and over again, and it has kind of complicated rules, that is, as some of you may know, but you roll the 2 dice and look at the sum. If it comes up a 2 or a 3 or a 12, then you lose right away. If it comes up a 7 or an 11, then you win right away. If it comes up some other number, like let's say a 4, then you keep on rolling until you either get another 4 and then you win, or until you get a 7 and then you lose. Pretty complicated rules, right? So why do they have such complicated rules? Well, because when you work it all out, and it's kind of complicated to work out all the things, you get the probability of winning of 49.2929%, which is just less than 50%, right? So you could say, well, does it really matter that it's just less than 50%? And suppose you repeatedly make $10 bets on craps, and I'm going to consider various probabilities. What's the chance that you will double your fortune before you go broke? So let me just quickly run another simulation. And this is one where you're going to start, this black dot represents how much money you have, and you're starting with $100, and you're going to bet $10, so you're either going to win or lose $10, and it happens randomly. So in this case, you lost. So you went down to $90. Then you bet again, and this time, you won, you're back up to $100. And you won again, you're up to $110. And so for any one bet, you have a 49.2929% chance of winning. But on the other hand, now we're betting over and over again, right? So it's kind of repeated randomly. It's kind of like flipping those coins over and over again. And in this case, we're saying, what's the chance you'll get up to $200 here first before you lose all your money and get down to 0? And since I don't have much time left, let's make it go a little faster. So we're doing these bets, and each time, again, you're either winning or losing your $10. And, what's the chance? Well, you go up and down for a while, and it's kind of exciting. That's why people like to go to the casino. And, you're not doing too well at the moment. You might not win, but you might. You're coming back. You're not doing great. I may have to speed it up again. So let me go a little faster with all these bets going on. You're winning, you're losing. You're doing pretty well now. Now you're losing. You're hanging in there. Oh, you did it. Congratulations. So you all started with $100. And you went up to $200, so that's pretty good. And you have a chance of doing that. And in fact, it turns out in this case you have about a 43% chance of getting up to $200 first. So it's not that unlikely. But suppose we start with, let's say, $1,000. And now you've got $1,000, and you're still betting the same $10 on craps each time. So sometimes you go up a little, and you can see it's not moving too much because it's all around 1,000. And now we ask the same thing. What's the chance you'll go up to $2,000 first before you lose all your money? So I'm going to have to go faster. So let's go to fast warp speed now. We've done a couple of 100 bets. And I'll maybe go even faster. And it's taking a while. Oh, and you mentioned you lost your money, right? So the point is, as you do more and more bets, what happens? So one way to think about it is in terms of these probabilities. And if you start with $100, what's the chance you'll reach $200 before zero? As I said, it's about 43%. If you start with $1,000, now what's the chance you'll get up to $2,000 before you lose all your money? Well, what do you think? Maybe less, right? Turns out it's not impossible. It's about a 5.5% chance. So less likely, right? So you're doing more and more betting. What if you start with $5,000? What's the chance you'll get up to $10,000 before you lose all your money? Well, what do you think? Not too likely, right? Because you're doing more and more. It turns out it's about 1 chance in 1.4 million. Extremely unlikely, right? What if you start with $10,000? What's the chance to get up to $20,000 before you lose all your money? Not too likely, right? About 1 chance in 10 million billion. Right? Just never going to happen. There's less than the chance of winning Oz Lotto by a lot. Right? So the point is, if you go to the casino, if you bet a few times, you might win, you might lose, whatever. But as you bet more and more over and over, again, this law of large numbers kicked in. And in this case, that tiny house advantage works against you. So as you run things longer and longer, they get closer to their true probabilities. And that's why the house edge matters. I mean, if it was a 50-50 game, these would all be 50%. But it's a little bit less than 50-50, and it makes all the difference. And other casino chance games mostly follow this way. And I guess I don't really have time, but I just was going to mention at least that my research area is Monte Carlo methods. And what's Monte Carlo? Well, first of all, it's this beautiful region south of France, right? Nice place for rich people to go. And in fact, I once was at a conference that they very cleverly had at the Monte Carlo, and that's me there as one of the statisticians at a conference. But Monte Carlo is actually a way of running randomized algorithms, and I won't really talk about it now, but I'll say that when you have complicated statistical models for, let's say, a medical experiment with lots of patients and so on, or financial models and so on, you need to weigh the evidence, and it turns out you need to do hard computations, which aren't very easy to do. And even computers, which are really, really fast, they're not fast enough to do those computations. So instead, you take a sort of a poll. So it's kind of like taking a poll that we've discussed, and you do it with the right probabilities, and then with a large enough sample, you can think of it as being a small margin of error. You get closer and closer to getting the right probabilities. And by the law of large numbers, you get the right thing. And you can use algorithms, which I won't get into to do that. But the point is, it's a huge area of modern research. If you search in Google, there's millions of people doing Monte Carlo algorithms for science. And it uses some of the same ideas we discussed. These ideas that you repeatedly do things over and over again and use the law of large numbers, kind of like taking a sample, kind of like getting a smaller margin of error. And it turns out to be a very important area of science. So just to kind of wrap things up, and I'm happy to take questions and talk and whatever, but probabilities, randomness, and other ideas in mathematics, statistics, and so on, they really are everywhere. They're all around us, and the more you can understand them, even just a little bit, the more you can sort of appreciate the world on a new level. You can avoid worrying about things that really aren't that likely. You can make better decisions for things like casinos. You can understand opinion polls better, and so on. So I'll leave it at that, and all the things I talked about and more on my website, probability.ca, and I'll wrap up there again. Thank you very much for having me.
As Jeffrey said, he's happy to have any questions. So, just
one day I hope you visit Tasmania and see the beautiful gallery we've got there.
Thank
and
you.
the guy that owns it's a private gallery. His name's David Walsh.
Right.
He actually invests in lotteries. So what would be your comment about that?
You said he invests in lotteries, meaning he
Yeah,
owns part of the lottery company, or
no, he's in South America. I think he's got
Right.
various.
Yeah.
He's a very smart sort of guy. So is there a chance at all, or what was the
Well,
person have to do
I mean,
to have a chance in
yeah.
lotteries?
Well, of course, I'd have to see the details, right? But as far as, if you're asking, is there any way you can make money off lotteries? I mean, people try various things, and some of them are just bogus. People think, I've got a system, right? I only play odd numbers on alternate Tuesdays, and now I'm going to get rich, right? And I don't obviously believe any of those kind of systems, but there could be a case, for example, if the lottery jackpot happens to be very high, such that even if you bought every possible ticket and every possible number available, you'd still spend less than you'd make up in the jackpot. Even those schemes don't usually work because most of these big jackpots could be shared if more than one person picks the winning number. So there's a lot of question marks. Oftentimes there could be a sort of arbitrage thing where you facilitate somebody else buying the tickets, but it's in another country and you get your cut and so on. So I would have to see the details of Mr. Walsh's books, I guess, to be sure. But if he's making money off it, maybe he's found some way to do so. But okay.
So you were talking before about we're changing our school system to include more statistics and stuff like that. A lot of people, fall into these fallacies with statistics.
Yeah.
Do you feel like there's a pretty easy intuition that can be imparted that would just like solve a lot of these kind of problems for general interpretation?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's certainly true that I think humans are not that well wired to have a good understanding of randomness and probability, and a lot of people don't have good intuition. And for example, a lot of people will think things that are actually extremely unlikely aren't so unlikely. Sometimes I think of it like, for example, if you think of us evolving when we traveled in small packs of people, and if you heard that somebody was killed by a lion, that meant one of your 50 closest friends was just killed by a lion. There's probably lions around, and you should be afraid that it's going to happen to you too. Whereas now, if there's a newspaper headline saying, hey, somebody was just killed in some horrible way, that's one person out of the millions and millions of people that the newspaper would reach. So somehow it's possible that we evolved in sort of a different situation than we have now, and I think it is hard to sort out these sort of randomnesses. So, is there any one simple intuition? I wouldn't say so, but I'd say that the more that children do learn at a young age these kind of probability and randomnesses, I think the better. And one of the points I tried to make in my book is that even without understanding a lot of things about randomness, but just looking a little bit at the basics, how likely is that to happen? Or, how many people did that happen to out of how many people lived in the city or whatever? Those things can kind of go a long way. So if there's anything that I hope to get across this way, it's that before you start believing in something or being afraid of something or planning on something, just look a little bit at the numbers and look a little bit at what it means. So I think that's possible. I mean, a lot of people don't feel very comfortable even looking at basic numbers. And, people don't even want to check to see if their lottery ticket was a winner. So they're probably not going to check a lot of other numbers either. But I would encourage people, just check just a little bit. Just get some sort of a sanity check on these things. And it can go a long way. And so I think if it is true that more children in Australia are being taught these things at a younger age, then I think that's great.
I'm interested.
Sorry, go here first, guy. Go ahead.
I'm interested in the coin toss simulator. What does that mean to manufacture randomness? So what kind of algorithms go?
Right. Okay. So I mean, what my programs do, and what most computer programs that use randomness do, is really use what's called pseudo-randomness, as you probably know, and that's to say, it uses algorithms which just sort of multiply numbers and take remainders and do things so that it sort of seems to be random by most observations, but in fact, it's not truly random. And if you want computers to be truly random, people do try to do that using things like the heat of the CPU, or using quantum mechanics things, or using the speed at which somebody types and those kind of things. But they're sort of hard to control. So for the most part, when we run Monte Carlo, we just use this pseudo randomness. But it's a good question, and it is interesting to try to get really true randomness. But we mostly just use these algorithms which kind of fake the randomness.
And something like a lottery, what would they be using?
So some lotteries, I mean, a lot of lotteries just have a big bin of numbers, right? And literally, I don't know if somebody reaches it, I guess normally they have a machine that sort of blows the balls around it. I don't know if Oz Lotto works that way. I don't know if anybody knows, but yeah. But at least the lotteries in Ontario, they do. And in fact, they usually broadcast it so you can actually see the big bin of numbers spinning around and then one of the balls coming out. And so that's a form of randomness, kind of a physical randomness that I think is pretty valid. At the casinos, it's sort of interesting because, of course, a lot of casino randomness either from actually spinning a wheel or from rolling dice or that kind of thing, but a lot of them aren't, right? And I don't know what the casinos here are like, but we have these video lottery terminals and video poker and stuff where it's really just some internal computer program, and I'm always surprised that people are willing to pay them because you're just kind of trusting that whoever programmed this programmed it fairly so that you'll win sometimes. Whereas at least with the spinning wheel or the dice, you can kind of see what the randomness is, so at least you know what the probabilities are. But in that case, kind of a physical randomness. So, yeah.
Professor, you earlier mentioned about a lottery that the retailers were stealing money from the punters.
Right.
Is there any statistics that the organizers or the owners of the lottery stealing money from the punters?
The owners of the lottery, like the lottery company.
Because why I mentioned this because years ago I saw a TV on reality TV, one of the lottery in America, and the fact they showed that at certain time of the lottery day, the agents are all closed. You can't buy any more tickets.
Right.
And then in the main office of the organizers, you saw a big screen as big as this that shows all the numbers that were taken by computer.
Okay.
So if there was one number which was not taken, there's a possibility that They can put in that number.
I
and
see.
they
They
will
can
be
just buy the
jackpot
tickets that
themselves.
haven't already been taken. Okay.
Yes.
Well, I haven't seen that particular scam, and I'm not sure if it happened. Are you trying to respond to that, or yeah? Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
So the lotteries in Australia have a policy of returning 60 cents for every dollar that's spent to get as prize money. So you could argue every round there's still.
Well, that's certainly true. That's certainly true. I don't think that's his question, though, right? His question is whether at the company they had a way of being dishonest and maybe buying the tickets that hadn't already been taken and so on. So I'm not familiar with that case. I think for the most part, the lottery companies try to run it, quote, fairly, but as you say, it's fairly with a heavy tax on it. And I think they do because they don't want to undermine the confidence in the system. But yeah, it's certainly true that the lotteries take in more money than they give out, and then they try to convince people they have a better chance of winning than they do, which I guess is a form of being dishonest, maybe. But okay, anyway, should we take maybe one last question here and then? Okay,
I was just a comment, so I'll
okay. Okay. Well, maybe should we wrap up then? But anyway, I'm happy to stay and chat afterwards. But let's wrap up now.
Okay, well, let's thank Professor Jeffrey
Okay.
Rosenthal. Remember, Jeffrey does have a book outside if you want to purchase a copy. He's happy to sign a copy and talk with people.